3 men climbed a frozen hill, certain they were coming to dig a grave. A widow, alone in the worst storm in memory. No fire could last that long. No woman could. They had seen what the cold did to the strong, let alone to the grieving and the small. The wind screamed. The snow swallowed the world whole. And then they reached the top of the rise and saw it, a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. "Last of her furniture," one of them sneered, "burning the chairs to buy an hour." They knocked, expecting silence. A cold body by a dead hearth, but the door opened, and what poured out of that small cabin into the freezing dark was the warm, golden smell of fresh bread. She stood there, steady, unbroken, not even shivering. And not one of those men understood, yet, what they had truly walked into. The wind had been screaming for 2 days when the 3 men finally broke through the last drift. It was not the sound of ordinary weather. It was something higher, thinner, a long, knife-edged shriek that scoured the white hills and slipped through wool and leather and skin until it found the bone underneath. The land lay buried. Snow stood waist-deep across the flats, and where the wind had piled it against rock and ridge, it rose higher than a man could reach. The whole world had gone pale and featureless, as if some cold hand had wiped the country clean of color and left only this, white, and the wind, and 3 small figures struggling through it. Their leader was an older man named Amos Hartley. His face was the kind a hard country carves over many winters, lined, weathered, set into a quiet endurance. He pushed forward with his head bowed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the cold, one heavy step sinking after another. Behind him came Silas Crane, and Crane was not silent. He cursed the snow with every stride, low, steady, a bitter little stream of words that the wind kept tearing away before they could land. He was a man who measured the world in profit and loss, in what was owed and what was owned. And to him, this whole frozen errand was a fool's accounting. "We are wasting our time, Hartley," he called out, his voice scraping against the gale. "She has been alone out here for a week. No woman survives this. Not in a cabin built for 2. Hartley did not turn. He only kept climbing, snowshoes biting, breath pluming. "You don't know her," he said. "I know Winter," Crane snapped back. "Winter doesn't care how stubborn a widow is." The third man said nothing at all. He was young, barely past 20, and his name was Tobias. He kept his head down and followed the broken trail the older men left behind. He had been brought along for his strong back, and for the work he believed was waiting for them at the top of that rise, because they all believed the same thing. They were not climbing toward a rescue. They were climbing toward a grave. They all knew the story. Everyone in the scattered country around did. A man named Elias Voss had taken sick in the autumn, his lungs filling slow and certain, until one gray morning he simply was not there anymore. He left behind a wife, an aging mother under her roof, a patch of hard-won land, and a winter coming on like a closing fist. For a widow with no help and no neighbors near, that kind of winter was a sentence. So when the storm came down off the hills and cut the homestead off from the world, Hartley had waited 2 days, listening to the wind rattle his own walls, watching the snow rise, and on the 3rd morning, unable to bear the not knowing any longer, he had gone for help. and pulled Crane along, because a man like Crane was the sort whose presence the country expected at such things. And now they had come to the last rise, and there, below them, the cabin appeared. It was a small dark shape against all that swirling white, half swallowed by a drift that swept up its eastern wall and onto the roof as though the storm were slowly drawing it under. Crane stopped. He laughed, short and ugly. "Well, look at that," he said. "There's still smoke." And there was, a single thin ribbon of it, pale, fragile, almost lost against the gray sky, rising from the stone chimney. "Last of her furniture, most likely," Crane went on, "burning the chairs to buy another hour. We had best be quick, before the embers die with her." Hartley said nothing, but his eyes had fixed on that fragile thread of smoke, and something in his chest pulled tight, because smoke was a sign, but a cruel one. A fire could burn long after the hand that built it had gone still. He had seen it before. A warm hearth and a cold body beside it. He quickened his pace. His heart was a heavy, anxious drum as he half stumbled down toward the porch. And from inside the cabin came a sound that froze all three of them in their tracks. A deep, guttural bark. Sharp. Furious. Alive. "The dog, at least," Tobias murmured, pulling his collar higher. "The dog's still breathing." They reached the porch. Hartley stomped the snow from his boots. A small, ordinary sound in a place that no longer felt ordinary at all. He raised a gloved hand and knocked, hard. "Mrs. Voss," he called. "It's Amos Hartley. I've brought men. We've come to help." The barking surged, a wall of sound, ferocious and warning. And then, from somewhere beyond the door, a voice. A woman's voice. Calm, even, unhurried. "Bear," it said. "Quiet." And the barking stopped. The three men stood very still. Footsteps approached. Then the scrape of a bolt drawn back, crisp and loud in the cold. And the door opened, not flung wide in desperation, not creaking on a tomb, but simply opened, a few inches first, then wider. And a woman stood in the gap. She was not the thing they had come expecting. She was not the gaunt, frost-blue figure of their imagining, not the wraith curled cold beside a dying fire. Her hair was pulled back, neat and smooth. She wore a plain wool dress and a clean apron. Her cheeks held color. Her hands were steady. And she was not shivering. Not at all. Behind her, rolling out into the bitter air like a tide, came warmth. Real warmth. And with it, impossibly, the smell of fresh bread. It struck the men like something physical. 3 frozen travelers standing at the edge of a white wasteland. And there, just past the threshold, was the golden scent of baking, the deep heat of a steady fire, the soft glow of a room that did not know it was supposed to be a grave. A large dog stood at the woman's side, watching them. A low growl still humming somewhere in its chest, its dark eyes weary but bright. The woman looked at the 3 of them, and her gaze was clear. This was Adeline Voss, a widow, alone, they had thought. Doomed, they had been certain. She studied their snow-caked coats, their stunned faces, the disbelief carved into every line of them, and when she spoke, her voice carried no fear, no desperation, no gratitude for a rescue she had apparently never needed. "Mr. Hartley," she said softly, "I'm surprised to see anyone out in this." A pause. "You must be frozen through." She stepped back and opened the door the rest of the way. "Please, come in." For a long moment, none of them moved. Hartley's mind reeled, trying to fit the warm and ordered room before him over the cold ruin he had been preparing his heart to find. Tobias stood, with his mouth slightly open, the breath caught in his young throat. And Crane. Crane's eyes swept past the woman and into the room beyond, across the blazing hearth that did not sputter, the neat stack of dry, well-cut wood beside it, the loaves rising under a clean cloth, the shelves lined with jars, the sacks of flour standing against the far wall. This was not the scene of a desperate survivor. This was a home, ordered, provisioned, at peace, as though the storm raging outside were nothing more than a rumor. Crane's jaw tightened, slow and hard, because a man who comes expecting to pick over the bones of someone's failure is rarely glad to find no bones at all. Adeline noticed. She noticed everything, but she only held the door and waited while the wind clawed at the men's backs and the warmth called them forward. One by one, they stepped inside, and as the door closed behind them, sealing out the white and the howling and the long climb of their certainty, not one of those three men yet understood what they had truly walked into. They had come to a grave, but they had found a fortress, and the woman who had built it was only beginning to be seen. The storm did not break. If anything, as the gray afternoon wore on, the wind found a deeper voice, a long, hollow moan that pressed against the cabin walls and rattled the single window in its frame. Snow gathered in the corners of the glass. The light outside dimmed from white to a kind of bruised silver, and then toward something darker still. There would be no leaving. Every man in that room knew it, though none of them said it aloud. The trail they had broken to reach this place was already healing over behind them, swallowed stride by the falling snow. To step back into that howling country now would be to walk willingly into a grave of one's own making. Adeline knew it too. She accepted it the way she seemed to accept everything, without alarm, without complaint, with a quiet that was almost unsettling to watch. "You'll stay the night," she said. It was not a question. It was not even an offer. It was simply the truth, spoken plainly. "There's no getting back to town before this breaks. I'll make up pallets by the fire. There are blankets enough, and the floor's warm near the hearth." Hartley nodded, turning his hat slowly in his weathered hands. "We'd be grateful," he said, "and we carried rations of our own. We've no wish to be a burden on you, Mrs. Voss." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "There's plenty," she said, and she turned back to the stove. And that was the end of it. Tobias settled gratefully near the hearth, holding his red, raw hands out toward the flames, his young face soft with relief and wonder both. The big dog, Bear, watched the boy for a long moment with those dark, weary eyes, then lowered his great head back down onto his paws, satisfied, it seemed, that this one at least meant no harm to anyone under his roof. But Crane did not settle. Crane could not. He moved through the small cabin the way a wolf moves along the bars of a cage. His eyes went everywhere, counting, weighing, cataloging. He was a man who had spent a lifetime understanding the world as a ledger. So much owed, so much owned, every kindness a transaction wearing a friendlier face. and what he saw in that warm, ordered room simply would not balance. It refused to balance, and the refusal of it gnawed at him like a stone in a boot. He stopped beside the woodpile. He stood there a while, saying nothing, one gloved hand resting on the topmost log. Then he turned, slow, and fixed his gaze on the woman working calmly at her stove. "This is a great deal of firewood, Mrs. Voss." She did not look up from her work. "It is, and it's good wood." He lifted a length of it, turned it in the firelight, set it down again with deliberate care. "Oak, hickory, seasoned dry, clean through to the heart of it." A pause, sharp as the edge of a knife. "The merchants ran dry of seasoned hardwood a long while back. Folk for miles around are burning green pine and praying their chimneys don't choke on the soot of it." He let the silence stretch out, long and thin. "So tell me, how does a widow, alone, with no man to swing an axe, come by a full cord of dry oak this deep into a winter as hard as this one?" The question was not admiration. It was an accusation, dressed up in the borrowed clothes of curiosity. But Adeline did not flinch from it. She set down her knife, she turned, and she looked at Silas Crane with a patience so steady it was almost worse than anger. The patience of a woman explaining something simple to a man too proud to have understood it on his own. "My husband cut it," she said. "Your husband." Crane's voice thinned. "Your husband has been in the ground for months, Mrs. Voss." "He cut it last summer." Her voice never rose, not an inch. "And on through the fall, while he still had the strength for it. He said a hard winter was coming. He could feel it, in his joints, in the way the birds left early, in the very smell of the air before the first frost. And a dying man hauled all of this inside himself, did he? He didn't have to haul it anywhere." She wiped her hands slowly on her apron. "Come," she said, "I'll show you." She crossed the room to the back wall, where a heavy canvas curtain hung against the rough-hewn boards, and she drew it aside. There, set neatly into the wall, was a small, sturdy door. She lifted the latch. A breath of cold air swirled in around their ankles. But beyond it, in the dim, the men could see a narrow covered space. A lean-to, built snug against the very back of the cabin, and it was filled, floor to rafters, with neatly stacked firewood, dry, sheltered, patiently waiting. A whole winter's worth of warmth gathered against the dark, and a door to bring it in, armful by armful, without ever once setting foot into the storm. Tobias let out a low, astonished breath. "He thought of everything," the boy said softly. Crane said nothing at all. He shut the little door with a sharp, hard thud and let the curtain fall back across it. His jaw worked behind his cheek. He had come up that hill expecting to find a woman crushed by a country too cruel and too vast for her. And instead, at every turn, he kept finding the fingerprints of a careful, loving mind, a mind that had reached out from beyond the edge of its own ending, only to keep her safe. It unsettled something deep in him, a man who has built his life on the belief that the weak deserve their ruin, does not care to be shown, again and again, that the weak were never weak at all. The afternoon deepened toward evening. The good smell of baking bread gave way slowly to the smell of stew, rich and brown, simmering low and patient on the back of the stove. Adeline moved through her small kitchen with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful to watch. No wasted step, no hesitation, each thing in its place, each task taken up in its proper turn. And in the corner of the room, in a worn rocking chair drawn close to the warmth, sat an old woman, silver-haired, frail as winter grass, her thin hands folded in her lap over a small basket of mending she no longer had the strength in her fingers to finish. This was Hazel, Adeline's mother. She did not speak much, but now and again her pale eyes would drift to her daughter, and something would soften and ache in her deeply lined face. A tenderness, and beneath the tenderness, a worry she was far too proud to ever speak aloud. "You ought to rest, Mama," Adeline said gently, passing behind the chair, letting her hand come to rest for just a moment on the old woman's thin shoulder. "I rest all the day long," Hazel murmured. "Resting is the only thing I'm good for anymore." "That isn't true." "It's the truest thing in this whole house, child." And Adeline did not argue the point. She only let her hand linger there, one quiet beat longer than she needed to, before she moved on to her work. Crane watched the small exchange from across the room, and behind his hard, deep-set eyes, something cold and calculating turned over slowly, like a coin. He drifted, as though idly, toward the supplies stacked against the far wall, the sacks of flour, the rows of glistening jars, the careful, deliberate provision of it all. He ran a single finger along the rim of a wooden crate, and when at last he spoke again, his voice had changed entirely. Lower now, smoother. The voice of a man circling something he means to take. "You've a fine store here, Mrs. Voss," he said. "Finer than most in town, I'd wager. But a widow alone, with no man to break the ground come spring, no hand to mend a fence or drive the stock." He let it hang there in the warm air. "It's a hard thing, a claim like this one. More than a single woman ought to have to carry on her own. There'd be no shame at all in letting it pass to someone who could make proper use of it. I'd see you treated fairly, generously even." Adeline went still, just for a single moment. Then she turned and she looked at him, and the warmth in that room seemed to draw back from the few feet of space that lay between them. "You offered me that same fairness once before, Mr. Crane," she said, "when my husband was barely cold in the ground." Crane's smile did not waver. "A kindness, pennies on the dollar," she said, "for everything he built, for everything he died building, with his own two failing hands." Her voice stayed perfectly level, but there was iron beneath it now, bright and cold and utterly unbending. "You called it charity, I recall. I remember well enough what it truly was." "Times change, Mrs. Voss. A winter as hard as this one changes a person's reckoning of things. It hasn't changed mine." And she turned back to her stew. Just like that, the conversation closed, gentle but absolute, the way a heavy door swings shut. And Silas Crane was left standing there with his offer hanging unanswered in the air between them, a man wholly unused to being dismissed, and liking it not at all. Hartley, who had watched the whole of it in silence from his place by the fire, finally spoke. "Leave it be, Crane. I was only making conversation. I know well enough what kind of conversation you were making." Hartley's tired old eyes did not so much as blink. Leave it be. The fire popped and settled. The wind moaned long against the eaves, and for a good while after that, No one in the small cabin said anything at all. It was as the last of the daylight bled out of the window that the first true trouble came. Adeline had gone to her mother's side, a small cup of something warm in her hand, and Hazel had taken only a sip before she pressed it away. "My chest is tight tonight," the old woman said quietly. "My medicine, child. The drops." Adeline went to the shelf. She took down a small dark bottle and tipped it, and her face changed. Just slightly. Just a flicker that only a daughter's eye or a watchful stranger's might have caught. It was nearly empty. "There's another," she said, half to herself. "He laid in another, in the cellar." "A cellar?" Crane's head came up. "There's a cellar?" "Elias dug it the first summer," Adeline said, already reaching for her shawl. "Before the roof was even finished. He always said a full larder mattered more than a fine ceiling." She paused. "The door to it is outside, around the back. It'll be buried under the drift by now. And I can't shovel that much snow alone." Hartley was already on his feet. "Then you won't have to," he said. "Tobias, coats." Crane rose as well, but not from kindness. No. He rose because there was another secret about to be uncovered in this maddening house, and he would not be left behind to wonder at it. "I'll come," he said flatly. And so the three men bundled themselves once more against the cold and stepped out into the blue-dark world behind the cabin, a landscape of strange, sculpted drifts, the snow piled into long frozen waves by the ceaseless hand of the wind. Adeline stood in the doorway, lamp held high, and called out to them over the wind. There, by the slant of the ground, the doors lie flat against the earth. And they dug. The snow was heavy, layered, packed hard beneath a soft skin of fresh powder, and it fought them for every shovelful. Hartley and the boy fell quickly into a steady sharing rhythm, but Crane attacked the drift with a kind of frustrated violence, stabbing and flinging, as though the snow itself were the thing that had been thwarting him all the day long. It was the boy's shovel that struck wood first. Working together now, the three of them cleared the heavy, slanted doors. Hartley bent and hauled one of them open on its iron hinges, and a breath of cold, dark, earthy air rose up to meet them, and a flight of stone steps led down into the black. Adeline came with the lamp. "I know where it sits," she said. "Let me go first." She descended, the light throwing long and trembling shadows across the damp stone walls. Hartley followed close behind her, his curiosity stronger than the cold, and what the lamplight found below stopped the breath in his chest. The cellar was larger than any of them would have guessed from above. A cool, dry room, and it was stocked the way a fortress is stocked against a siege. Shelves lined 3 walls, groaning under the weight of glass jars. Vegetables, fruit, meat, all of it put up and sealed and waiting. Bins of potatoes and onions and turnips. A barrel of salted pork in the corner. Eggs preserved in their crocks. It was the harvest of an entire desperate, devoted season, laid down by a dying man for a family he already knew he would not live to feed. Adeline reached up to a high shelf and took down a small dark bottle, the twin of the one running empty above. "Here it is," she said. But as she turned back, the lamp caught her face. And in that wavering light, Hartley saw, for just a moment, the thing she had kept so carefully hidden all that long day, the exhaustion of it, the grief. Her calm was not the absence of fear. It was a discipline, a wall held up by sheer will against everything pressing in behind it. He did all of this, Hartley said softly, for you. It was not a question. She nodded. A single, weary motion. He knew he was sick long before anyone put a name to it, she said. He knew he'd not see another spring. So he spent the last of his summer down here, in the cold and the dark, putting up food he'd never taste. Her voice trembled, just slightly. The first true crack in all that careful composure. He called it his legacy. Not the land, not the cabin. This, the means for us to live, when he no longer could. You honor him, Hartley said gently, by being so strong. A sad, small smile touched the corner of her mouth. I'm not strong, Mr. Hartley, she whispered. I'm only doing what he told me to do. I'm following the map he left me. That's all. From above, Crane's voice came down sharp and impatient. What's keeping you all? Did you find the thing or not? Adeline tucked the bottle safely into her shawl, and her composure folded itself neatly back into place, like a letter returned to its envelope. We're coming, she called up, and they climbed back into the howling night. It was later, with the medicine given and Hazel breathing easier, and the men spread once more before the fire, that the boy asked the question. Tobias asked it the way only the young can, plainly, without guile, his eyes still full of everything he'd seen in that cellar. How did he know, ma'am? All of it. The wood, the stores, the shed built right into the wall. How does a man come to think of all that? Adeline was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out a small book. It was bound in leather, worn soft at the corners, the color of old honey in the firelight, the kind of book a hand returns to again and again until the very binding has learned the shape of the fingers that hold it. She set it on the table where the light could find it. He left this, she said. The men looked at it. No one spoke. My husband. And now her voice changed, grew softer, and somewhere far away. When the doctoring ran out, when there was nothing left to do but wait for the end of it, he didn't waste the waiting. He spent his last weeks right here, at this table, writing every night. Long after I'd gone to my bed, the lamp would still be burning low. She rested 2 fingers on the worn cover, but she did not open it. He wrote down everything, what to plant and when to plant it, how to read a storm in the color of the sky, how to keep the fire through the longest of the nights, how to clear the snow from the roof before it crushed us, how to mend the things that break. A breath. He drew pictures so I'd be sure to understand. He made his lists. He thought of things I'd never once have thought of, things he must have lain awake in the dark imagining, all the ways this world might try to take me, and how I might stand against each one. Her thumb moved slowly over the soft leather. He even left letters, she said, one to be opened for each month of the winter, so that even when he was gone from me, I would never have to face the dark of it entirely alone. The room had gone utterly still. Even the wind beyond the walls seemed, for a breath, to hold itself quiet. Hartley's throat worked. When he found his voice, it came out rough as gravel. That's the most... He stopped, tried again. In all my years, I've never once heard the like of it. It isn't a journal, Adeline said. It's a map A map he drew so I could find my own way through a country he knew. In his heart, he could never walk beside me. She looked up, and her eyes shone wet in the firelight, though she did not let them spill. Everything you've seen in this house, the wood, the food, the warmth of it, none of it is mine. It's his love, still working, still keeping me, even now. For a long moment, no one moved at all, and then Crane laughed. It was a small sound, ugly, the laugh of a man who cannot bear to be moved, and so reaches for scorn the way another man might reach for a railing in the dark. How convenient, he said, a dead man's instructions, and not a soul left living to ask him a single question. Hartley turned on him, slow and dangerous, but Adeline only looked at Crane, long, steady. And something in that quiet look made the merchant's thin smile curl at the edges and slowly die. "You think it's convenient, Mr. Crane," she said softly, "because you have never once in the whole of your life loved anything more than your own comfort." The fire cracked in the hearth, and Silas Crane said nothing at all. For the second time that night, the conversation closed, like a door swinging gently, finally shut. The hours after should have passed in quiet. The men spread their pallets near the fire. The dogs circled 3 times and settled with a heavy sigh. Hazel was helped to her small bed in the corner, and Adeline tucked the blanket up beneath her chin the way a mother tucks in a sleeping child. A gentle reversal. The daughter, the keeper now. "It's cold tonight," Hazel whispered. "I'll keep the fire high, Mama. You always do." The old woman caught her daughter's hand and held it in both of her own, thin and papery and faintly trembling. "You're stronger than he ever knew, you know. Stronger than you yet know yourself, child." Adeline smiled and pressed the frail hand gently. "Sleep now, Mama." And she lowered the lamp. But the night did not let them rest. It came in the deep dark, the blackest hollow of the small hours, when the fire had burned low to embers, and the wind had finally, strangely, begun to die away. It came as a sound, a small sound, a catch of breath, a thin, broken gasp from the corner where the old woman lay. Adeline was awake before she knew that she was awake. She was across the room before her feet had remembered the floor beneath them. "Mama!" Hazel's eyes were open, wide, frightened. One hand clutched at her own chest, the fingers curled like a claw, and her breath came in short, tearing pulls that seemed to find no bottom, that went nowhere at all. "Mama, I'm here. I'm right here. Look at me. Look at my face." But the old woman could not answer her. Her lips had taken on a gray-blue cast in the dim light. Her skin had gone clammy and cold to the touch. And her heart. Adeline could feel it beneath her own pressed palm. Her heart was hammering, fast and wild, and terribly wrong, like a small bird flung again and again against the bars of its cage. The men were stirring now, Hartley rising. Tobias scrambling up from his pallet, his young eyes wide with the helpless terror of one who does not yet know what to do with such things. "What is it?" Hartley said. "What's happening to her?" "Her heart," Adeline said. "It's her heart." And in that single, terrible moment, she reached for the book. Of course she did. It had answered everything else. Every trial, every threat, every question this cruel season had set before her. Her husband had foreseen and answered his careful hand reaching across the dark to steady her trembling own. She seized the worn leather book. She threw it open. Her fingers flew through the pages. Fire, roof, water, weather, planting. The long and careful catalog of all the ways he had thought to keep her safe. And it was not there. This was not there. There was no page for this, no drawing, no patient list. He had imagined the snow and the cold and the wolves at the edge of the dark, but he had not imagined this. He had not thought to teach her how to hold her own mother's failing heart in her two bare hands. The book had no answer. For the first time in all that long winter, the book had no answer at all. And Adeline knelt there in the dim, her dying mother gasping before her, the useless open pages spread across her lap, and the full and terrible weight of it crashed down upon her all at once. He was gone. He was truly, finally, wholly gone, in a way that somehow, until this exact and breaking moment, she had managed not to let herself feel. The map ended here. The hand that had guided her every step had reached as far as it was ever able to reach, and now there was only the dark beyond the last edge of the page. And her. Only her. Something broke open in her chest, and something else rose up from somewhere deep within her to fill the space where it had been. She let the book fall. She let it slide from her lap to the floorboards, its pages fanning out, and she did not look at it again. Because the answer was not in the book. The answer was in her. It had been in her all along. "Tobias!" Her voice came out clear, clear as struck glass, clear as the cold air itself. The chest at the foot of her bed. There's a flask inside it. Dark green glass. The stopper sealed in wax. The strong cordial. The one for when her heart races too hard. Bring it to me. Now. The boy moved. "Mr. Hartley, build that fire up high. She's gone cold. Cold all the way through, and we have to warm her. But slowly. Not too fast, never too fast. Heat a stone at the hearth and wrap it in cloth before you bring it. Bare heat against cold skin will do more harm than good." Hartley moved, and Adeline turned back to her mother. She slid an arm beneath those frail shoulders and lifted, easing the old woman up and against her own body so that she no longer lay flat, so that the laboring lungs at last had room enough to pull. "Up, Mama. Sit up against me. There now. I've got you. I have got you." She did not know where the knowledge came from. Some of it, perhaps, from a long ago memory. A thing she had once watched a midwife do. A thing an old neighbor woman had said in passing, years and years before. And some of it from nothing she could name at all, from instinct, from the deep and wordless wisdom of a daughter who would not let her mother slip away into the dark. Tobias pressed the green flask into her waiting hand. She broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. She tipped the smallest measure of it between her mother's parted lips. A single drop, and then another. Coaxing, patient, watching the old throat work to swallow it down. "Slow, Mama. There. Breathe with me now. Don't fight against it. In and out. With me. In and out." And she breathed, slow and deep and steady, right there beside her mother's ear, so that the frightened, racing thing inside that frail chest might find the rhythm of it and follow it home. In and out. The wrapped stone came, warm and heavy in its cloth. She tucked it gently against her mother's side. She chafed the cold, thin hands between her own. In and out, and slowly, so slowly that for a long and agonizing while, not one of them dared to believe it. The gasping began to ease. The tearing breaths grew longer, deeper. The wild bird of that old heart began, beat by stubborn beat, to slow, to settle, to remember at last how to be a heart and not a war. The gray-blue tint receded from the withered lips. A faint color, faint as the first light of dawn, crept slowly back into them, and Hazel's eyes, which had been so wide, so terribly afraid, found her daughter's face, and softened. "There you are," the old woman breathed. "I'm here, Mama." The tears stood in Adeline's eyes now, finely, freely, but her hands had never once trembled, not through any of it. "I'm right here. I've got you. I've got you safe. You—" Hazel's voice was a thread, the thinnest thread. "You knew what to do." Adeline looked down at her mother's face, and then, slowly, she looked across at the book, lying open and forgotten on the floorboards, its pages stirring faintly in the warmth of the rising fire. "No, Mama," she whispered. "No, I didn't know." A long, shaking breath. "I just did it anyway." The men stood in the firelight, silent, shaken, changed. Tobias was weeping openly now, the way the young weep when they have brushed up against something far larger than themselves. Hartley stood with one hand pressed hard against his own mouth, his eyes wet and shining, gazing at the woman on the floor as though he were seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time. And Crane stood apart at the very edge of the firelight, and on his hard face was an expression that he himself could not have named. He had told himself a comforting story all this long and unsettling day, that her survival was no more than a dead man's luck, that she was only a vessel carrying out instructions left behind by a cleverer hand than her own, that there was no true strength in the woman at all, only inheritance, only borrowed foresight. But he had just watched the book fail. He had watched it fall to the floor, useless in the moment of greatest need. And he had watched the woman save a life with nothing in her two hands at all, nothing but her own steady will, and the thing inside her that no husband had ever given her, and no winter could ever take. That story he had told himself was a lie, and some cold, miserly, long-buried corner of Silas Crane's heart knew it now, and could not unknow it. Dawn was still hours away. Adeline did not leave her mother's side. She held the old woman as her breathing slowed into the long, even rhythm of true sleep, as the warmth crept back into her hands and her feet, as the fear drained slowly out of that frail and dearly beloved face. She held her, and she watched the dying fire, and the book lay where it had fallen. And after a time, Hartley came and crouched down beside her. He gathered up the fallen journal gently and closed it, and set it on the table within her reach. He did not speak for a long while. Then, low, so as not to wake the others, "He couldn't have written that one for you, Adeline." She did not look away from her mother's sleeping face. "No," she said quietly. "He couldn't have." "There are some things." Hartley searched for the words, turning his rough hands over in his lap. "Some things a body just can't be handed, can't be taught from off a page. They have to already be in you, and either they are, or they aren't. He looked at her, steady and certain. And they're in you, Adeline. They were always in you. He gave you a fine map, true enough. But the one who walked it tonight, through the dark, with no page to read from. A pause. That was you. That was you, and no one else. For a long moment she said nothing, and then, very quietly, she did a thing she had not done in all the long and frozen months since the lamp on that very table had finally gone dark for the last time. She let herself be seen. Just a little. Just for a moment. Her shoulders, which had held themselves so straight for so very long, eased the smallest fraction. Her chin dipped low, and a single tear traced slowly down the line of her cheek, and fell, unhurried, into the soft silver hair of the mother sleeping safe in her arms. Not a tear of weakness. Something far harder won than that. The understanding, dawning slow and enormous and quiet inside her, that she was not, after all, merely the keeper of a dead man's careful love. There was a steel in her that no husband had handed her and no grief had ever taken. It was hers, all the way down, and it would not break. And outside the small cabin, the wind had nearly died away to nothing now, gathering itself, perhaps, in the dark and the cold, for one last and far greater fury still to come. But within those sturdy walls, in the deep and silent hour before the dawn, a widow sat holding her mother in the fading firelight, and for the first time since the cold, had taken the man she loved out of the world. She was not afraid of the morning to come. The dawn, when it finally came gray and grudging. A pale, weak light seeped through the frosted window, and it found a room utterly changed from the one the night had held. The fear had passed. Hazel slept on, deep and even, her thin chest rising and falling with a steadiness that, only hours before, had seemed lost for good. Adeline still sat beside her. She had not moved in all that time. She had simply kept her vigil, a hand resting on her mother's, her own eyes open against the dark. And the men had not truly slept either. They lay on their pallets or sat near the embers, and there was a quiet among them now that had not been there before. A different kind of quiet. The quiet of men who have watched something they cannot explain, and have not yet decided what to do with the watching of it. Hartley was the first to rise. He crossed to the hearth and built the fire back up, log by careful log, and the light of it spread warm and golden through the room. He set water to boil. He moved gently, the way a man moves in a house where someone has been ill. "She's sleeping?" he asked, low. "She is," Adeline said, "truly sleeping now." "Good." He looked at her a long moment. "And you? Have you slept at all?" "I'll sleep when this storm has gone." But the storm, it seemed, had other plans. For even as she spoke the words, a sound came down off the hills. It began as a sigh, a long, rising sigh, far away, somewhere out beyond the buried world. And then it grew. It gathered. It came rolling down toward the small cabin like a thing alive and hungry, and it struck the eastern wall with a force that rattled every board and shivered the glass in the window. The wind had returned, and it had come back stronger than before. Tobias sat bolt upright. "I thought it was passing," he said. "I thought it was nearly done." "It was only catching its breath," Hartley murmured, his eyes drawn to the ceiling, to the dark beams above their heads. "Storms like this one, they save the worst for last." Outside, the new snow began to fall. Not the soft drifting of the day before, but a driving, slanting white hurled sideways on the gathering wind. It piled against the walls. It climbed the eastern side of the cabin, drift upon drift, higher and heavier with each shrieking hour. And the cabin, brave and small, hunkered down beneath it. By the middle of that gray and sunless day, the snow had piled deep against the roof, and the roof had begun to speak of it. The first groan was so low that only Hartley heard it. He went still, his cup of coffee halfway to his lips. He set it down. He listened. It came again. A deep, woody groaning from somewhere above and to the east. The sound of immense weight, settling. "That's the snow load," he said quietly, and he rose to his feet. "It's getting heavy up there. Too heavy. If it packs down wet and dense, those rafters won't hold it." Crane stirred where he sat, and something flickered in his deep-set eyes. Here, at last, was a thing the woman could not have foreseen. Here was a trouble that no dead man's journal could mend. A roof was a roof. Snow was snow. And clearing it was the hard, dangerous work of living men. "Then it'll have to come off," Crane said, and he got to his feet, almost eager. "We'll need shovels, a ladder. Someone has to get up top and clear it before the whole thing comes down on our heads." "No one's climbing onto that roof," Hartley said flatly. "Not in this wind. You'd be torn off and flung into the next county before you took your second step." "Then what would you have us do? Sit here and wait to be buried?" The roof groaned again. Longer this time. Deeper. And Adeline rose from her mother's side. She crossed the room, quiet and certain, and the men turned to her. Because by now, even Crane, in some place he would not yet admit to, had learned to turn to her. "My husband knew this cabin sits in the path of the wind," she said. "He knew how the snow would gather on the eastern side. He thought about it, the way he thought about everything." She walked to the corner of the room, and she pointed upward. There, bolted to the great central beam, was a heavy iron ring. And from it hung a thick, coiled rope, its end fixed neatly to a hook on the wall. "The western pitch is steep," she said. "The wind scours most of the snow from it clean, but the eastern side is shallow, and it catches the drift, and it holds it." He saw that this might happen, so he reinforced those rafters, and then, in case the load grew too great even for that, she lifted the coiled rope down from its hook. He left this. Hartley came closer, his builder's eye following the line of the rope, the placement of the ring, and slowly, understanding began to spread across his weathered face. "A man stands on the ground on the western side," Adeline went on. "He throws the end of this rope up and over the peak of the roof. Once it's caught, 2 men below take it, 1 to each side, and they draw it back and forth, like a saw. It bites in beneath the snow at the base of the drift, and it cuts the whole frozen mass loose, and the snow slides off the steep western pitch, all on its own." A silence. "No one ever has to set foot on the roof at all," she said. Hartley let out a long, slow breath. He looked at the rope. He looked at the ring bolted to the beam. He looked at the angles of it, the leverage of it, the quiet and perfect understanding of wind and weight and snow that the whole simple thing contained. "By all that's holy," he said softly, "he really did think of everything." And Crane stood and stared at the rope, and at the woman, and at the rope again. He had come up that hill as a man of consequence, a man who took charge. He had imagined himself the rescuer, striding into a scene of helpless ruin, bending a desperate situation to his will. But there was no helpless ruin here. There never had been. And there was nothing for him to take charge of at all. He understood with a slow and bitter heat rising in his chest. He was merely a guest in a house far better prepared for this storm than his own fine house in town would ever be. Every quiet competence of this woman was a fresh humiliation laid upon the last. Every turn of the dead man's foresight was a stone added to the weight he already carried. But there was no time for his bitterness now. "Mr. Hartley," Adeline said, "will you help me work the rope? It takes 2 below and 1 above to make the throw. Tobias has the arm for the throwing, I think." "I do," the boy said quickly, rising. "I can do it." And so they bundled against the cold, and they went out into the screaming white. It was brutal work. Tobias, his young face set hard against the driving snow, gathered the weighted end of the rope and hurled it up toward the peak. The wind caught it the first time and flung it back at him, and the second time, and the third. But the boy was stubborn, and his arm was strong, and on the 4th throw, the weighted end sailed up and over and vanished down the far steep side of the roof. "It's over," he shouted. "It's caught." And then Hartley took one end and Adeline the other, and they began to draw, back and forth, back and forth. The rope bit into the snow with a low, grinding rasp, sawing slowly through the frozen base of the great drift that lay piled upon the eastern pitch. Adeline's hands burned in her gloves. Her arms ached. The cold reached into her chest with every breath she pulled, but she did not stop. She set her feet, and she leaned her weight into it, and she pulled. A widow, alone in the world, sawing a mountain of snow off her own roof, with a rope her dead husband had left her, in the heart of the worst storm in living memory. Back and forth, and then a sound, a deep, sliding rush from up above, the whole frozen mass of it, cut loose at last, breaking free and sliding down the steep western pitch in a great roaring avalanche that thundered to the ground on the far side of the cabin. And then, silence. The roof had stopped its groaning. The danger had passed. The 3 of them stood in the snow, breathing hard, white to the eyebrows, and Tobias let out a whoop of pure, exhausted joy. Even Hartley laughed, a short, startled bark of it, the way a man laughs when he has stared at something and found it good. But Adeline only looked up at the cleared and silent roof, and she thought of the hand that had drawn the picture of this very moment, long ago, by lamplight, knowing he would not be here to see it work. "Thank you," she whispered, "to the wind, to no one, to him." And she turned and went back inside, into the warmth. While they had labored out in the storm, the cabin had not been empty. Hazel slept on in her corner, and Silas Crane sat alone by the fire, or believed himself alone, save for the old woman and the dog watching him from the hearth with one half-open eye. The journal lay upon the table. Adeline had set it there in the night, and in the rush of the morning, she had not taken it back up. It sat in the firelight, that small honey-colored book, holding all its secrets. And Crane could not help himself. He told himself he only meant to look, to see with his own eyes what manner of thing could make a hard man like Hartley go soft, and a stranger's boy weep into the fire. He told himself it was simple curiosity, but that was not the whole of it. For Silas Crane was a man with a secret of his own, a heavy one, a cold weight he carried behind his fine coat and his hard, certain manner. And it had everything to do with why he had wanted this woman's land so badly, and for so little. He drew the book toward him. He opened it, and he read. The pages were close written, in a neat and patient hand. Lists, drawings, the careful catalogue of a man's love. He turned them, faster, his eyes moving over the words. And then he stopped. He had come to a page near the back, a page that was not instruction at all. It was a kind of map, a rough drawing of the land itself, the slope of it, the line of the trees, the run of a creek that crossed the lower corner of the claim. And there, where the creek bent, the dead man had marked a small, careful note. A spring, a deep, cold, never-failing spring, fed from beneath the hills, the kind of water that did not run dry in the cruelest summer, the kind of water a man could build an empire of cattle upon. Crane sat very still. He knew this land. He had ridden past it 100 times and thought it nothing but rock and scrub, but he had not known about the spring. No one had known. Only the quiet man who had walked every foot of it and noticed everything and written it all down in his honey-colored book. And slowly, the full shape of it came clear to Crane. This was why. This was why a part of him had pushed so hard. Why he had come up this hill telling himself it was charity, telling himself he was saving the woman from her own ruin. He had wanted the land for reasons even he had not fully understood. Some instinct, some merchant's nose for value he could not yet name. But there was more to it than that. There was the other thing, the cold weight behind his coat. For Silas Crane was not the prosperous man the town believed him to be. Behind the full shelves of his store and the fine cut of his clothes lay a mountain of debt. Promissory notes he had signed in better years, money owed to hard men in distant places who did not forgive and did not forget. He had overreached. He had gambled on a boom that never came, and the floor beneath his comfortable life had grown thinner and thinner until he could feel the cold draughts of ruin rising up through the cracks of it. He needed this land. Not wanted, needed. This land, with its hidden spring, was the one thing that might save him. He could see it whole, in an instant. The cattle, the water, the fortune that would lift him clear of the debts that were closing slowly around his throat like a noose. And it belonged to a widow. A widow he had been so certain he would find frozen dead in the snow. His hand tightened on the edge of the book. His face, in the firelight, had gone pale and strange, because he understood now, fully, the bitterness that had been driving him all along. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was fear, the cornered, desperate fear of a drowning man who has just seen, in the hand of someone weaker than himself, the only rope that might pull him from the water. And then the door burst open, and the cold came roaring in, and the three of them stamped back inside, white and laughing and alive. Crane shut the book. He set it back on the table, quick, as though it had burned his fingers, and he turned his face to the fire so that none of them might read what was written upon it. But Adeline saw. She saw the book moved an inch from where she'd left it. She saw the strange pallor on the merchant's hard face. She said nothing, but she saw, and a small cold knowledge settled into her, quiet as snow. The trouble in her house, she understood now, was not only the storm outside. The worst of it should have ended there. The roof was clear. The fire was warm. The danger had passed, and the long day was bending toward another night, and there was even, despite everything, a kind of fragile peace settling over the small and crowded room. But Peace and Silas Crane could not long share the same four walls, for he was a man unmade, a man who had just stared into the pit of his own ruin and seen, in the same glance, the woman who held the rope that might save him, and would never, he knew, hand it over, not to him, not after everything. And the knowing of that turned in him like a blade. He needed to be useful. He needed desperately to prove that he was not the helpless guest this house had made of him, that there was still some trouble here that only a man like him could mend. And so when the fire began to smoke, he saw his chance. It came on slow. A wisp first. A thin gray curl drifting back into the room instead of rising up the chimney. Then more of it. The wind outside had shifted, swinging hard around to the north, and it had driven the snow up and over the chimney's mouth and capped it, packing the flue with ice and white. The smoke had nowhere to go. It began to pour out into the room, billowing from the hearth in thickening gray clouds, and Hazel woke with a cough, her hand flying to her chest. The chimney, Adeline said, already moving. The winds capped it with snow. A cabin full of smoke was no small thing. It was death, slow and quiet, if the door stayed shut, and death, fast and freezing, if the door swung open to the storm. Hazel was coughing harder now. Bear had begun to bark. The gray haze thickened in the air. "We have to get up top and clear it," Crane shouted, seizing his coat. "It's the only way, same as the snow." "No," Adeline said, sharp, certain. "The wind's far too strong now, and we don't need the roof." She was already at the hearth. She pointed to a small iron lever set low into the stonework at the side of the fireplace. A detail so plain, so easily missed, that not one of them had so much as glanced at it in all their hours in that room. "He built a second flue," she said, her voice quick and even. "It vents out through the side wall, below the roof line. For exactly this. If the main chimney is ever blocked or damaged, this lever opens it. Help me. It sticks." But Crane was not listening. Something had snapped in him. The drowning man, the cornered animal, the bitter fear of his own ruin. All of it boiled up at once into a sullen, reckless need to act, to do the thing himself, to be, just once in this terrible house, the man who saved them all. "That's nonsense," he spat. "A side vent won't draw. The only way is from the top, and I'll not stand here choking on a dead man's foolishness." And before anyone could move to stop him, he seized the heavy iron poker from the hearth. "I'll clear it from here." And he drove it up into the chimney with all the wild strength of his fear, ramming it upward again and again against the packed and frozen snow. "Crane, no!" Hartley lunged for him. Too late. There came a grinding screech of iron against stone, and then a sickening, splitting crack. The old clay liner of the chimney, struck by the full violence of that blow, broke, and everything came down at once. A great choking avalanche of soot and broken snow and shattered shards of the cracked flue came raining down into the open fire. And where there had been a thin gray haze, there was now a vast, billowing, blinding wall of black smoke surging up and out into the room. The blockage was not cleared. It was worse. And the chimney itself was broken. "You fool!" Hartley roared, hauling the man back by his collar. "You've killed us! You've killed us all!" The room was filling with terrible speed. The smoke was everywhere, thick and acrid and stinging, clawing at their eyes and their throats. Hazel was gasping, bent double in her chair. Tobias dropped to the floor, where the air was clearer. Bear barked and barked, frantic, somewhere in the gray. And Silas Crane stood frozen in the center of it all, the poker hanging useless from his hand, his face a white mask of pure and dawning horror. He had finally found his crisis. He had finally made himself the center of it. And it was the kind that kills. But Adeline did not waste a single breath on him. She did not scream. She did not turn to rage. She moved, swift and clear and certain, the way she had moved in the dark over her dying mother, with that same deep calm rising up beneath the chaos. "Tobias, get my mother to the door. Crack it open, just enough for her to breathe the clean air. Hold it there. No wider." The boy obeyed. "Mr. Hartley, water. The bucket's by the wall. Douse the fire. Drown it. We can't let it feed the smoke." Hartley moved, and Adeline seized the small iron lever at the side of the hearth, the one Crane had scorned, and she pulled. It was stiff, stuck fast with long disuse. It did not give. She set her feet. She wrapped both hands around it. She threw the whole of her weight against it, her knuckles white, the cords standing out on her wrists, every ounce of her strength and her will poured down into that one small bar of iron. "Come on," she breathed. "Come on. He built you for this. Open." And with a deep groan of protesting metal, it moved, it gave, it swung, and somewhere in the wall, a hidden passage opened to the outer air, and a new draw caught, a faint but steady pull, sucking sideways at the choking gray. The smoke began to bend, to turn, to pour slowly, slowly into the new vent and out through the side wall, away from their lungs and their burning eyes. It was not enough. Not yet. The room was still thick with it, and Hartley's buckets of water on the fire raised great hissing clouds of steam to mingle with the smoke. But it was something. It was a beginning, and it was hers. Crane watched it all from where he stood, rooted, ruined. He watched the woman he had scorned, the widow he had come to bury, save the very lives his own blind panic had so nearly snuffed out. And she did it with a lever he had called foolishness, in a house he had called a failure, with a calm he could not have summoned to save his own soul. He had wanted to be the one who saved them. Instead, he was the one they would have to be saved from. And in the bending smoke and the hissing steam, in the gray ruin of that broken hearth, Silas Crane learned at last the full and bitter measure of himself. The fire was drowned now. The room slowly began to clear. And through the thinning haze, Adeline turned and looked at the man with the poker still hanging in his hand. She did not shout at him. She did not need to. She only looked, long and level and quiet. And that quiet was a heavier judgment than any words could ever have carried. Outside, the wind howled on through the broken dark, and inside, In the cold and smoke-stained room, a widow stood between her family and ruin, breathing hard, her hands black with soot, her eyes clear. The storm was not finished with them yet, and neither, it seemed, was the night. The fire was dead. For the first time since the three men had stumbled in out of the storm, the great hearth at the heart of the cabin held no flame. Only a black, sodden ruin of drowned embers and fallen soot, and the broken throat of the chimney above it, gaping and useless. The smoke had thinned at last. It had bent its way out through the small side vent, that hidden passage the dead man had built against just such an hour, and the worst of the choking gray had cleared from the air. But the room had paid for it. The walls were streaked with black. A bitter, burnt smell hung over everything. And the cold was coming. It crept in now from every corner, slow and patient, no longer held back by the steady, radiant heat of the open fire. The men felt it first in their fingers, then in the backs of their necks, then everywhere. Hazel sat in her chair, a blanket drawn tight around her thin shoulders, and she watched her daughter with frightened eyes. "The fire's gone, Adeline," she said softly. "The fire's gone out." "I know, Mama." Adeline crossed to her, knelt, took the old cold hands between her own. "I know, but we're not finished yet. Not by a long way. Look at me. We are not finished." And she rose, and she turned, and she looked at the ruined hearth. She understood what had to be done. She had known it, perhaps, from the moment the chimney cracked, but the knowing of it sat heavy in her chest, for it meant a kind of surrender. The open hearth was the soul of the cabin. It was the warmth her husband had built around. It was the heart of the home they had made, the fire she had kept burning through every long night since the cold had taken him. And now she would have to put it out for good. "The chimney's broken," she said, her voice steady, pitched so all of them could hear. "Even if we cleared the snow off the top, the flues cracked clean through. It'll never draw right again. Every fire we light in that hearth will fill this room with smoke." "Then what's left to us?" Hartley asked. "The stove." She nodded toward the small cast-iron cook stove against the wall, squat and dark and modest, the humble workhorse of her kitchen. It vents through the side wall, the same as the emergency flue. Separate from the chimney, it's sound. A breath. It won't be the same. It won't warm the room the way the hearth did, but it'll keep us from freezing. If we close the hearth off entirely, seal it, so the cold and the broken flue can't pull the heat back out of the room and up that ruined chimney. Seal it with what? And here Adeline paused, because the answer was a cost, another one, paid not in money, but in something her husband had set aside and told her to guard with her life. "There's a roll of waxed canvas," she said, "up in the rafters, heavy, treated to turn water. He laid it by for mending the wagon cover, or for an emergency shelter, if it ever came to that. It's worth more than near anything else in this house. Out here, a thing like that can't be easily had." She looked up at the dark beams. "We'll have to nail it across the whole face of the hearth. Seal the opening tight against the stone. It's the only way to hold the heat the stove can give us." Tobias looked stricken. "But you said—" He set it by. "For a shelter. In case—" "I know what I said," her voice gentled. "And I know what he meant it for. But he meant all of it for one thing in the end. For us to live." She managed the smallest of smiles. He'd not begrudge the canvas. Not for this. And so it was decided. Hartley fetched the ladder and went up into the rafters, and after some searching brought down the great heavy roll of waxed canvas, stiff with cold, and they laid it out across the floor. The work was slow and clumsy in the dim, smoke-stained light. There was no lamp to spare for it. They worked by the thin glow of the stove, now stoked and laboring to push its small warmth into the chilling room. Hartley measured the canvas against the wide stone face of the hearth. Tobias held it steady while the older man cut, and Adeline worked among them, guiding, steadying, her hands sure on the heavy fabric. She found her husband's tool chest, and his hammer, and his nails, and she pressed them into willing hands. Here, along the top edge first. Pull it taut. Taut as you can. There must be no gap for the cold to find. They drove the nails. The hammer blows rang flat in the deadened room. Inch by inch, they stretched the thick waxed cloth across the mouth of the hearth, sealing it tight to the cold stone, until the great open heart of the cabin was covered over entire. And Crane stood to one side. The poker had long since fallen from his hand. He had not spoken since the chimney broke. He had not been asked to. And now he stood at the edge of the small stove's light, useless, his face slack with a shame so deep it had hollowed him out. He watched the woman he had scorned work to undo the ruin he had wrought. He watched the boy and the old man labor under her quiet command, and not once did any of them turn to him for help or ask him to lift a hand. That, somehow, was the worst of it. Not their anger. He could have borne their anger. He had earned it. And a man can stand inside a thing he's earned. But they did not give him their anger. They simply worked around him, as though he were a piece of furniture, as though his hands, which had brought them to the edge of dying, were not worth the trusting now even to hold a nail. He had wanted, all his life, to be a man of consequence, and he had never, until this cold and ruined night, understood how little consequence a man truly has when the people around him have stopped expecting anything good from him at all. At last he could bear the silence no longer. "Let me help," he said. His voice came out rough, unused. "There must be something. Let me hold the cloth. Let me drive a nail. Something." The work stopped. Hartley straightened slowly, the hammer in his fist, and there was a hard light in his tired eyes. He opened his mouth, and whatever was about to come out of it would not have been gentle. But Adeline spoke first. "He can hold the lower edge," she said quietly. "Tobias's arms are tired." It was not forgiveness. It was something smaller, and in its way, harder. It was a task, a place, a single thread of usefulness extended to a man who had cut every other one with his own pride. Crane crossed the room. He knelt at the base of the hearth, and he took the lower edge of the canvas in his two hands, and he held it taut against the stone while Hartley drove the last of the nails. He did not speak, but when the work was done and he rose, his hands were trembling, and it was not from the cold. The ceiling held. The moment the last nail was set, the change was plain. The thin warmth of the laboring stove, which had been pouring uselessly up the broken chimney and out into the storm, now had nowhere to go but into the room. The bitter edge of the cold pulled back just slightly, just enough, It was not the deep, golden warmth of the open hearth. The room had lost its glowing heart. Where the fire had danced, there was now only a flat, dark patch of waxed canvas, stretched and nailed and grim. The light was meaner. The shadows pressed closer. Something of the soul of the place had been covered over, but they would not freeze. And that, this night, was everything. The long dark settled in. It was a different kind of night than the one before. The storm still raged beyond the walls, but inside the mood had changed. The frantic crises had passed, one after another, and what remained was something quieter and heavier. The slow, cold ache of endurance. The hours a body must simply outlast. They ate a cold supper, bread, and the last of the preserved meat, by the dim glow of the stove. No one had the heart for more than that. Hazel was settled first, tucked deep into her bed in the corner, warmed and watched. The men spread their pallets near the stove, drawing as close to its small heat as they dared. And the cabin grew quiet, save for the crackle of the stove, and the endless moan of the wind, and the soft, troubled breathing of people who could not quite find their way to sleep. It was in that deep quiet that Tobias spoke. He spoke low, his young face turned toward the dull red glow of the stove. And his words were not meant for everyone. They were meant, it seemed, mostly for himself. "My pa used to say," the boy murmured, "that you could tell the measure of a man by what he does when everything's falling apart around him." No one answered, but Crane, lying awake on his own pallet, went very still. He said most men, when the trouble comes, they grab for whatever makes them feel big. They want to be the one who fixes it, the one everybody looks at. The boy was quiet a moment. "And he said the trouble is, half the time, that's the very thing makes it worse. The wanting to be the hero. It blinds a man." Tobias rolled over, pulling his blanket close. "I never understood what he meant by that," he said softly. "Not till today." And then the boy said nothing more. But in the dark, Silas Crane lay with his eyes open, staring up at the rafters, and the boy's quiet words sat on his chest like a stone. For he knew, with a terrible clarity, that the boy had been speaking of him, not cruelly, not even on purpose, perhaps, but the truth of it had found him all the same, and there was no door he could close against it. The wanting to be the hero. It blinds a man. He had nearly killed them all, not from malice, from need, from the desperate, drowning need to matter, to be the one whose hand turned the moment. And that need had been blind, and it had been deadly. And a boy young enough to be his own son had named it in the dark without even meaning to. Crane closed his eyes, but sleep did not come for him that night. It did not come for a long, long while. Across the room, Adeline sat awake beside the stove. She did not lie down. She could not. Some watchfulness in her would not let her rest while the cold pressed in and her mother slept fragile in the corner. So she sat, her knees drawn up, a blanket about her shoulders, and she fed the stove a stick at a time, and she watched the small flames through the grate. After a time, Hartley came and sat beside her. He did not say anything at first. He simply lowered himself down onto the floor, a respectful arm's length away, his back against the wall, and he looked into the same small fire she was looking into. "You ought to sleep," he said at last. "You've not closed your eyes in 2 days. I'll watch the stove, and your mother, both. I give you my word." "I know you would," she said, "but I don't think I could sleep if I tried." "No," he said, "I don't suppose you could." They sat in the quiet. The wind keened. The stove ticked. And Hartley, turning his rough hands over slowly in the dim light, spoke again, low. "That was a fine thing you did. With the lever. The side flue." He shook his head slowly. "Most folk, in a room full of smoke, with a man swinging a poker like a madman, most folk would have lost their heads entire. You didn't lose so much as a thread of yours." "There wasn't time to lose it." "There's always time to lose it," he said. "Losing it is the easiest thing in the world. Keeping it, that's the hard road. And you walked it like you'd been walking it your whole life." Adeline was quiet a moment. "He used to say something like that," she said softly. "Elias. He used to say that fear was just a horse, that everybody's given one to ride, and the only question that ever matters is whether you're holding the reins or whether it's holding you." A faint, sad smile touched her mouth. "I always thought he was the one holding the reins, for both of us. I thought when he was gone, I'd just be carried off, wherever the horse wanted to take me." She looked into the fire. "But that's not what's happened, is it?" "No," said Hartley gently. "It surely isn't." He looked at her then, in the dull red glow, at the soot still smudged along her jaw, at the deep weariness around her eyes, at the straight and unbowed line of her shoulders, even now, after everything. And something moved in the old man's chest that he had not felt in a very long time, and did not quite have a name for, and would not have dared to speak, even if he had. He only said simply, "He was a lucky man, whatever else is true, to be loved by someone with that kind of steel in them." Adeline did not answer, but she did not look away from him either. And for a moment, in the small dark room, between the two of them, there passed something quiet and unspoken. Not a thing for now, not a thing for this cold and broken night, but a thing, perhaps, for some far gentler day still to come. Then she turned back to the fire and fed it another stick, and the moment folded itself gently away. It was deep in the night when her mother stirred. A small sound, a shiver. Hazel had drifted from sleep, and she lay curled small beneath her blankets, and even from across the room, Adeline could hear that the old woman's teeth had begun, faintly, to chatter. The cold had found her. The stove's mean warmth, which reached the men well enough where they lay close beside it, did not stretch far enough to fill the corner where Hazel slept. And the old woman, frail as she was, thin-blooded, just hours past the night her heart had nearly stopped. The cold could take her yet, quietly, in her sleep, the way the cold so often takes the old and the weak. Adeline was on her feet at once. She crossed to her mother. She felt the chill in the old woman's hands, the cold creeping into her cheeks, and a fear sharper than any she had felt all that long day rose up in her throat. And here was the thing. The journal had no answer for this either. She did not even reach for it this time. She did not so much as glance at the honey-colored book where it sat upon the table, because she understood now, fully, what she had only begun to understand in the dark of the night before. The book was a map of the country he had known, but she was standing in country he had never seen, and she would not wait for a dead man's hand to point the way, not any more. The way was hers to find. She stood there in the cold, and she thought, fast, and clear and entirely her own. The stove. The heat was at the stove. So the warmth must be carried to her mother, since her mother could not be safely moved into the open chill to reach it. She found the flat stones at the base of the stove, the ones used for warming. But there were not enough of them, and they would lose their heat too soon. She needed more. She needed something that would hold the warmth and give it back slow through the long remaining hours of the dark. Her eyes fell on the sacks, the flour, the dried beans in their heavy cloth sacks against the wall, and she understood. She took the sacks of beans, 2 of them, and she set them close against the warm iron flank of the stove, turning them, letting the dense weight of them drink in the heat. And while they warmed, she stripped the heavy curtain from the back wall, the one that hid the door to the woodshed, and she dragged her mother's mattress, the old woman still upon it, slow and careful, across the floor and close to the stove, into the heart of what little warmth there was. Then she took the bean sacks, warm now, warm clean through, and she tucked them in close around her mother's body, one at her feet, one at her back, the slow, deep, holding heat of them seeping into the old bones, giving it back patient and steady through the cold hours to come. She heaped every blanket in the house upon her. She lay down at her mother's back herself, and wrapped her own arms around the frail form, and gave her, too, the warmth of her own living body. And slowly the chattering stilled, the shivering eased, the old woman's hands grew warm again, and her breathing settled, and she sank back down into a deep and easy sleep, safe in the small fortress of warmth her daughter had built around her out of nothing but beans and stones and blankets, and the quick, clear working of her own unaided mind. Hartley had watched it all from beside the stove, and when it was done, when Hazel slept warm and safe, the old man looked at Adeline across the dim red light, and there was something in his face that was very close to awe. "There's no page for that one either," he said quietly. "No," Adeline whispered. "There isn't." And she held her sleeping mother, and she felt the truth of it settle deep into her bones. She was not following the map anymore. She was drawing it. She thought it was over then. She thought there was nothing left but to outlast the dark, to hold her mother through the cold hours, and wait for a dawn that would surely, eventually, come. But the night had one thing more to give her. It was Hazel, half waking once again toward the deepest part of the dark, who set it in motion. The old woman murmured, drifting, her mind wandering the borderlands of sleep. "Did you open it?" she whispered. "Open what, Mama?" "The last one." Hazel's eyes were closed. Her voice was far away. "He told me, before he went, he said there was one she wasn't to open. Not unless the worst of it came." A long, soft breath. "He said she'd know when it was time." And then the old woman sank back into sleep and said no more. But Adeline lay very still, for she knew the letter her mother meant. Among all the letters Elias had left her, one for each month of the winter, opened in their turn. There had been one more, one set apart from the others, sealed and unmarked save for a single line in his hand, to be opened only when there is nothing left. She had not opened it. Through all the long months, through grief and cold and labor, she had not let herself reach for it, because to open it would be to admit that the worst had come. that she had reached the very end of things, and some stubborn, hopeful part of her had refused again and again to believe she had fallen quite that far. But now the hearth was sealed with canvas. The chimney lay broken. The storm howled on without mercy. Her mother had nearly died twice over. The map had run out of country, and she had walked off the edge of it alone. If this was not the end of everything, then what was? Slowly, carefully, she rose from her mother's side. She crossed the cold, dim room, and she knelt before the old wooden chest at the foot of Hazel's bed, and she lifted the lid, and from beneath the folded linens, she drew out a single sealed letter, soft with handling, the ink of that one line faded but still clear, to be opened only when there is nothing left. She held it a long moment. Then she carried it to the stove, where the light was, and she sat down close to the small red glow, and with hands that were steadier than her heart, she broke the seal, and she began to read. The hand was his. Of course it was his. That neat, patient hand she would have known anywhere in the world. But the words were not what she had braced herself for. They were not instructions. There was no list, no drawing, no careful catalog of how to do a thing or mend a thing or weather a thing. None of it. There was only him, and what he had to say to her in the deepest dark, when there was nothing left. He wrote that if she was reading this, then she had come to a place beyond his reach, a place he could not prepare her for, because no man can prepare another for everything. And he had finally run out of foresight, as he had always known he must. And then he wrote the thing that broke her open. He wrote that the book, the journal, all of it, the wood and the cellar and the rope and the hidden flue, none of it had ever truly been about whether she could survive. He had always known she could survive. He had known it from the first day he ever laid eyes on her. He had married a woman with more steel in her spine than he had ever had in his own, and he had spent their whole life together watching her bend and never break. He had never once doubted she would outlast him, and outlast the cold, and outlast anything this hard world could throw against her. The journal was not a crutch for a weak woman. It was a gift to a strong one. He had not written it because he feared she would fail without him. He had written it because he could not bear the thought of her facing the dark with no piece of him beside her. The instructions were never the true gift. The true gift was simpler, and he had hidden it in a plain sight on every single page. The true gift was this, that for one more winter, she would not be alone. And now, he wrote, that winter was nearly through, and he had one last thing to ask of her, the hardest thing, the only thing he had never dared to write until this final page. He asked her to let him go. He asked her to stop living by his book, to stop being the keeper of his memory, measuring each day against what he would have wanted, what he had written down for her to do. He had given her the map to carry her across one dark season, not to chain her to a dead man's hand for all the rest of her days. She was not his legacy, he wrote. She was her own. She had always been her own, and the truest way she could honor everything they had built was not to guard it like a shrine, but to live fully and freely and forward, into all the springs he would never see, to find new warmth, to let new things grow, to set the book on the shelf one day and walk on past it into a life that was entirely, gloriously hers. "Go on, my love," he had written in the last line of all. "Go on, and don't look back. I was only ever the map. You were always the journey." The letter ended there, and Adeline sat very still in the dull red glow of the stove, the page trembling in her two hands. And then, at last, after all the long frozen months of holding herself together, of standing straight, of keeping the fire lit, and the fear leashed, and the grief pressed down somewhere deep where no one could see it, she let go. The first sob came up out of her like something tearing loose, and then another, and another. She pressed the letter to her chest, and she bent over it, and she wept. Not the silent, controlled tears she had allowed herself once or twice in the dark, but great, deep, shaking sobs that came up from somewhere far beneath words, from the place where there was nothing left. She wept for him, for the man who had spent his dying summer not in fear or bitterness, but bent over a table by lamplight, building her a way through the dark. She wept for herself, for the long months she had spent mistaking her own strength for borrowed strength, for all the days she had lived as a keeper, a follower, the woman who walked a dead man's map, when all along he had been begging her, from the very first page, to walk free. And she wept, at the last, for something that felt almost like joy, because the chains she had not even known she wore had just fallen away. She did not have to be his memory anymore. She only had to be herself. Hartley had risen. He came to her quietly, and he did not speak, and he did not reach for her, for that would not have been his place. He only knelt down nearby, a steady presence in the dark, the way a person stays close to another in their grief without crowding it. And he waited, and he let her weep. And across the room, in the shadows, Tobias lay awake and listened, and his own young eyes were wet. And Silas Crane lay awake too. He could not see the letter. He did not know its words. But he heard a woman weeping in the dark as though her whole heart were breaking and remaking itself at once. And something in the sound of it reached a place in him he had walled off so long ago he had forgotten it was there. For Silas Crane had loved someone once, and lost her, and he had never wept for it. Not once. He had locked the grief away and turned hard and cold and hungry, and he had spent all the years since reaching for land and money and consequence, trying to fill a hole that no amount of any of it could ever fill. He had built his whole bitter life around not feeling what this woman was feeling now, and lying there in the dark, listening to her let it out. Her grief, and her release, and the terrible freedom underneath it. Silas Crane felt the first crack run through the wall he had spent a lifetime building. He did not understand it yet. He would not understand it for a while longer. But something in him, that cold and frozen night, had begun, very quietly, to thaw. The storm wailed on beyond the walls, but inside the small dark cabin, a widow wept herself empty and then, slowly, full again. And when at last the tears had run their course, she sat up and she wiped her face, and she folded the letter with great care, and she held it to her heart one last long moment. Then she rose, and she walked to the table, and she set it down beside the honey-colored book. And she looked at the two of them lying there together, the map and the blessing, for a long, quiet moment. "All right," she whispered, to him, to the dark, to herself. "All right, my love, I'll go on." And outside, far off, in the deepest hollow of the night, the wind began, at long last, to die. The dawn that broke after that night broke clean. The wind was gone. Not dying now, not gathering for some fresh assault, simply gone as though it had never been at all. And in its place was a silence so deep and so total that it had a sound of its own, a vast white hush that lay over the buried world like a held breath finally released. Adeline opened the door, and the morning that met her stole the breath from her chest. The sky was a clear, cloudless blue, the blue of deep water, the blue of a thing washed and made new. And beneath it stretched a world transformed, an endless sea of pristine snow, untouched, unbroken, glittering under a low gold sun. The drifts had been sculpted by the vanished wind into long, smooth waves and curling crests, frozen mid-motion, beautiful beyond any telling. It was a deadly beauty. She knew that. The cold out there could still kill a careless soul in an hour. But this morning, in this light, it was only beautiful. "It's over," came Tobias's voice behind her, soft with wonder. The boy had come to the door, and he stood looking out at the shining world, and his young face was full of a relief so complete it was almost like grief. "It's really over. We can get home now." "Yes," Adeline said quietly. "You can." She looked out at the white and gold and the endless quiet, and she thought of all the night had held, the broken hearth behind her, the letter folded against the honey-colored book, the chains that had fallen away in the dark. The storm had taken her open fire, but it had given her something back that was worth 1,000 hearths. It had given her herself. They did not linger over the leaving. There was little, in the end, to say. Adeline packed them food for the long trek home. Fresh bread, the last of the preserved meat, wrapped careful against the cold. The men gathered their things. The dog, Bear, padded among them, his great tail swinging slow, as though he too understood that the siege was lifting. And then they stood on the small porch in the brilliant morning, ready to begin the long walk back into the world. Hartley turned to her. He held his hat in his weathered hands, the way he had that very first moment at the door. But everything between them had changed since then, and they both knew it. "What you've done here, Adeline," he said, "what you and your husband built, and what you did these past nights, with your own 2 hands, and nothing else." He shook his head slowly. "I've lived a long while. I've seen hard winters, and hard people, and folk who broke when the world leaned on them. I don't believe I've ever seen anyone stand the way you've stood. I'm sorry about your hearth," he added lower. "It was a cruel thing to lose." Adeline looked back into the dim room, at the flat, dark patch of canvas where the fire had danced. "A hearth can be rebuilt," she said. "Stone and mortar are only things." She met his eyes. "What matters is that we're all still here to rebuild it." And then she said something that surprised even her. "Thank you for coming, Amos, for climbing that hill when you might have stayed warm and safe and told yourself there was nothing to be done. You came anyway. That's the measure of a man, I think. Not whether he saves anyone, but whether he climbs the hill at all." The old man's throat worked. He nodded once and did not trust himself to speak. And then, after a moment, he said only, "If you've need of anything, for the chimney, For anything at all. You send word to me. I'll come. I know you will, she said. And in those 4 quiet words, something passed between them. Not a promise, not yet, but a door left gently open, a thing that might, in some far softer season, be allowed to grow. Tobias came to her last. The boy did not know what to say, the way the young so rarely do, and so he simply took her hand in both of his and held it a moment, and his eyes were wet. I won't forget it, ma'am, he said, any of it, as long as I live. Then it was worth the telling, she said gently. Go on home, Tobias, and mind what your father taught you. He sounds like a wise man. And then there was only Crane. He had stood apart through all the leave-taking at the foot of the porch steps, his face turned away. And when his turn came, he could not meet her eyes. He had no fine words. He had used up all his fine words days ago, and they had all of them turned to ash. He shuffled his feet in the snow. He opened his mouth and closed it. At last he managed only a low, broken mutter that might have been an apology, might have been nothing at all. And then he turned quickly and followed the others down off the porch and out into the white. Adeline watched the 3 of them go, 3 small, dark figures dwindling across that vast field of shining snow until the white and the gold swallowed them up entire. And then she went back inside to her mother and her broken hearth and her free and open life. The snow did not last. It never does. However deep it falls, however cruel the cold, the world turns and the sun climbs higher, and one morning the eaves begin to drip, and then to run, and the white retreats day by day into the shadows of the hollows, until even those give way. And under it all, patient and waiting, the green came back. It rose first in the low places where the meltwater ran, a blush of it across the hills, then the bold push of it everywhere at once, fierce and sudden, the way life always returns to a place that has nearly died. Not timidly, but with a kind of defiant joy. The air grew soft. It smelled of wet earth and new grass and growing things. And on the homestead, the signs of a new season were everywhere. The flat, dark patch of canvas was gone from the hearth. In its place stood new stone, fresh mortar, a chimney built better and stronger than before. Hartley had come himself to do it, with 2 other men, working from the careful diagrams in the honey-colored book. And now the fire danced again in the heart of the cabin, golden and alive. Adeline's garden was in. Long, neat rows of mounded earth, dark and rich. The first green shoots already breaking through. A whole summer's promise written into the soil. The cabin windows stood open to the warm breeze, and from inside came the sound of an old woman humming, for Hazel had not died. She had grown stronger with the warming days, her cheeks filling out, her step a little surer, her laughter coming more easily than it had in years. She sat now in her rocking chair by the open door, a basket of mending in her lap that she actually had the strength to finish, and she hummed an old tune to herself in the spring sunshine, while the dog lay sprawled in a patch of warmth at her feet, his tail thumping lazy against the porch boards. It was a place not merely surviving now, it was a place thriving, and Adeline moved through it all, lighter, straighter, freer than she had been in longer than she could remember. She still kept the journal, safe in its chest. She still read it, now and again, on quiet evenings. Not as a manual to obey. but as a letter from someone she had loved and would always love, and had finally learned to carry without being carried off by. She had set the book on the shelf, and she had walked on past it, into a life that was, at long and glorious last, entirely her own. It was on such a morning, with the bread fresh from the oven and the windows open to the green, that a wagon crested the rise. Adeline came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, expecting Hartley. For he came at least once a week now, sometimes with supplies, sometimes only to share a cup of coffee and talk through the long afternoon, and his visits had become a thing she found herself watching the road for. But it was not Hartley's wagon, it was Silas Crane. She had not laid eyes on him since the morning the storm broke, and he had changed. She saw it even from a distance. He sat hunched on the wagon seat, smaller somehow, the fine cut of his coat hanging loose on a frame that had thinned. When he climbed down, he moved like a man carrying something heavy that no one else could see. Bear lifted his head and gave a low, warning rumble. "Easy," Adeline said, and the dog quieted. Crane stopped at the foot of the steps. He held his hat in his hands, and for a long moment he simply stood there, looking up at her, and the old hardness was gone from his face, and in its place was something raw and uncertain and almost afraid. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "Mr. Crane, I've come to—" He stopped, wet his lips, tried again. "I've come to make you an offer for the land." And there it was, the old refrain, the thing he had come for, all those months ago, in the heart of the storm. The thing she had refused him then, with iron in her voice and a dead man's strength at her back. But she was not that woman anymore. She was someone stronger. Adeline came down one step. She looked at him, level and calm, and when she spoke, there was no iron in her voice at all. There was no need for it. There was only the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who knew, all the way to the ground of herself, exactly who she was and what was hers. "No," she said. Just that. One word. Simple. Complete. She did not reach for the journal. She did not call for Hartley. She did not borrow her strength from a dead man's foresight or a living man's presence. She stood on her own 2 feet, on her own land, in the spring sun, and she answered him with nothing but her own voice. "No, Mr. Crane, the land is not for sale. It was never for sale, and it never will be." And something in the way she said it, so plain, so sure, needing nothing and no one to prop it up, seemed to take the last of the air out of him. Crane's shoulders sagged. "I thought you'd say that," he murmured. "I knew you would, before I ever started up the hill." He gave a small, broken laugh, the laugh of a man at the very end of his rope. "I came anyway. I don't rightly know why." And then he did a thing that surprised her. He told her the truth. All of it. He told her about the debt, the mountain of it, hidden behind his fine store and his finer clothes, the money owed to hard men in distant places, the floor of his comfortable life gone thin and thinner until he could feel the cold of ruin rising up through every crack. He told her how the fear of it had made him hard and grasping and cruel. How he had looked at a widow alone in the snow and seen, God forgive him, not a woman in need. but a weakness to be turned to his own profit. And then he told her about the spring. "There's water on your land," he said, "down in the lower corner, where the creek bends, a deep spring fed from under the hills, never runs dry, not even in the worst of the summer." He looked at her steadily now, and his voice was quiet and sure. "I found it written in that book of his, the night of the storm, when I had no right to be looking in it at all." Adeline went very still. "That water," Crane went on, "makes this land worth 10 times what anyone in town believes, maybe more. A man could run cattle on a claim like this and never want for anything again." He drew a breath. "It would have saved me, if I could have had it. It was the one thing in all the world that might have pulled me clear of the water I'm drowning in." He looked down at the hat in his hands. "You didn't know about the spring," he said. "Did you?" "No," she said softly. "I didn't. You could have sold this place a dozen times over, for 10 times what it fetched, and never been the wiser to what you were giving away." He nodded slowly. "I could have come up here with a fair-seeming offer and robbed you blind, and you'd never have known the difference. You'd have thanked me for it." A long silence stretched between them, full of the hum of bees and the small sounds of growing things. "So why are you telling me?" she asked, and Silas Crane looked up at her then, and his eyes were wet, and his voice broke clean in two. "Because I listened to you weep in the dark," he said. "That last night, when you read your husband's letter, I didn't hear the words, but I heard what was underneath them. I heard a person let go of something they'd been holding too tight for too long, and feel free of it." He swallowed hard. "I had someone once," he said, "a long time ago, a wife, and I lost her. And I never wept for it, not once. I locked it all away, and I went hard and cold, and I spent the rest of my life reaching for things. Land, money, the look on a man's face when he owes you, trying to fill a hole that none of it could ever fill." His hands trembled on the brim of his hat. "And then I came up this hill, and I watched a woman I'd written off as nothing build a fortress out of love and grit and a sack of dried beans. And I watched her save her mother's life with her bare hands. And I watched her let her dead husband go so she could live." He shook his head. "And I understood, finally, what I'd done with my own grief. I'd let it turn me into the kind of man who'd rob a widow in the snow and call it charity." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I couldn't carry that. Not after seeing you. I couldn't take one more thing that wasn't mine to take, not even to save myself." The hat went still in his hands. "So I'm telling you about the spring," he said, "because it's yours. It was always yours. And a man has to be able to live with himself in the end. Even a man like me, even if living with himself is all he's got left." And he turned slowly to climb back up onto his wagon and ride away to whatever ruin was waiting for him. "Mr. Crane." He stopped. Adeline came down the rest of the steps. She stood before him, this broken man who had once come to bury her, and she looked at him for a long moment, and there was no triumph in her face. No satisfaction at the sight of a cruel man brought low. There was only something quieter and far harder to come by. There was grace. "You said a man has to be able to live with himself," she said. "Well, so does a woman. and I don't believe I could live very easily with myself if I sent a man down off this hill to drown, when I had a hand free to offer him." Crane stared at her. "I'm not going to sell you my land," she said, "but that spring is more water than one woman and her mother will ever need. There's a fair arrangement to be made there, I think, between honest people. Water for your cattle, a share of what it brings, worked out plain, on paper, with no one robbing anyone." She paused. "It wouldn't be charity, Mr. Crane. I've no use for charity, given or taken. It would be a bargain, a fair one, the kind your store never offered anyone in its life." The merchant's face crumpled. This proud, hard, hollowed-out man stood in the spring sunshine before the widow he had scorned, and he wept, openly, the grief he had locked away for half a lifetime, the shame of what he had become, the unbearable mercy of being offered a hand when he had reached for nothing but a throat. All of it came pouring out of him at once. "Why?" he managed. "Why would you do that? After everything?" And Adeline thought of a letter, folded against a honey-colored book. She thought of a man who had spent his dying summer building a way through the dark, not because he thought his wife was weak, but because he could not bear for her to be alone. She thought of how the truest strength she had ever known had never once been cruel. "Because someone taught me," she said quietly, "that what you build for the people who come after you matters more than anything you ever take for yourself." A small, sad smile. "He's gone now, but I find I'd still like to build the kind of thing he'd have been proud of. And I don't believe he'd have been proud of me for letting a man drown when I could throw him a rope." Crane wept, and he could not speak, and so he only nodded, again and again, his whole body shaking with it. And the spring sun shone down on the two of them, and the green pushed up out of the dark earth all around, and the world went on being born. The chimney drew clean and true now. Hartley's wagon was on the road again, as it was most weeks, and the dust of it rose gold in the late afternoon light. Hazel hummed in her chair. The garden grew, and somewhere down in the lower corner of the land, where the creek bent, a deep, cold spring ran on as it always had, asking nothing, giving freely, the way the best things do. Adeline stood on her porch in the soft evening, and she watched the road, and she waited for her friend. She was not the woman the three men had expected to find, that bitter morning at the top of the hill. She had never been that woman. She was not a frozen widow, not a victim, not a weakness to be turned to someone's profit, not even, anymore, the keeper of a dead man's careful love. She was simply herself, a woman who had been underestimated by nearly everyone who ever met her, for her quiet, for her grief, for the gray coming into her hair and the lines at the corners of her eyes, and who had turned out, in the bottom of the worst of everything, to be made of something none of them had thought to look for. She had learned a thing that winter, a thing worth all the cold it had cost her. A person's strength is not the absence of fear or grief or need. It is what they do with their two hands when the map runs out and the fire goes dark, and there is no one left to follow but themselves. She had walked off the edge of the map, and she had found, waiting there in the dark beyond it, her own 2 feet, and the solid ground beneath them. The wagon crested the rise, and Hartley's weathered face broke into a smile when he saw her standing there in the doorway of the warm and living home she had held against the dark. And Adeline smiled back and went down the steps to meet him, freely and forward into a season that was, at last, entirely her own.